When I talk about industry news as it applies to new software products for pro studios and home studios, you might be surprised how much there is to review. Plugins, virtual instruments, throw in a few DAW updates and an occasional new version, and it's amazing how busy this industry is. Welcome to Sam's Music Room. I'm Sam and I hope everyone is well. This is the first monthly installment of industry news, and it pertains mostly to recording software, plugins, virtual instruments, etc. And this will be evolving because as I went through and was making notes during the month of June, it got incredible how much information I was taking down for plugin updates, new plugins, DAW updates, virtual instruments, new virtual instruments. I could spend over an hour just naming the updates and new software, and I'm not sure that's time best spent. It might be better spent to review a product or two after a brief list of highlights for the month. So we'll see how this progresses after I get some feedback, and hopefully folks will have some ideas that make some sense. So I'm going to start by naming just a few announcements from June of 2018, and then I have a couple of thoughts regarding the updates and some of the new items. So Slate releases their virtual modeling microphone 2. Synaptic releases Intensity audio processor for mixing, mastering, and bringing out sound's inherent detail. Seaweed Audio has a Phantom synth. Brainworks has the classic British EQ 2098. Waves updates to version 10. Softtube has the American Classic A console emulation. SSL releases version 6 of their plugins. Skanote releases Echo Taps and WWW Wave, which I believe is a drum machine. Arturia updates Spark version 4. Tone Booster releases RealBus 4. Blue Cat's MB-7 Mixer 3.1. Propellerhead releases Drum Rack extension. Positive Grid announces Bias Mobile. Universal Audio releases Neve preamp for Unison and an update for the Universal Audio software, part of the Apollo package. For DAWs, Samplitude had an update. Studio One has version 4 release. That's a big release. Reaper update, a Cubase update. And you know, honestly, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's less than half, far less than half of June 2018 announcements for new software or software updates. And I haven't even touched on new hardware that is available for June of 2018. But here are just a few thoughts on June announcements. We have an incredible amount of choices for plugins, and they're inexpensive too. In the old days, even just a few years ago, you couldn't find plugins for typically under $100, or at least very few, outside of the free ones, obviously. And you know, Waves, who always was considered one of the expensive plugins to start, has sales now for $29 on plugins that just a couple of years ago people paid $149 for. So a couple things come to my mind. The choices are tremendous, and the amount of new choices available each month is tremendous. And there's good and bad about that. The good for consumers is that prices go down and you have a bigger selection, an opportunity to try new things. The downside is almost the same. When you have 10 new plugins released each month, for example, it's hard to take those plugins and really use them on a daily basis and get familiar with them as you should be. Not that you can't, but that can be a lot of work because really an EQ requires some time to find out how it applies to the tracks you're using or the mix that you're using, and if it works the way that you want, and have you learned how to use it properly so that in fact you understand if it does work on the tracks or the mix that you're looking at. If you have 4 or 5 plugins, EQ plugins for example, on your DAW that come included with your DAW, and you've purchased 10 in the last few months, that's 20 EQs. how long does it take you to properly learn how to use those EQs? So I would consider that the downside, because there's so much coming at us that, and it's so inexpensive that it's easy to buy, right? And set aside, and do we use it properly, and have we had a chance to learn and understand it properly? It's debatable. Although it's hard to argue, we have all these good options, so inexpensive, why wouldn't I try them? One of the things that I see that's interesting is most of the EQs and compressors and consoles that come out, they're modeled after classic EQs and consoles. So we look at the old SSL boards and the APIs and the Oxford, and we're emulating things. And here's what's interesting about that, or one of the things interesting to me, is most of us today, particularly the younger recording enthusiast, have never sat down with these hardware versions. So we're buying the software versions, and we're really hoping that they emulate what we think they're emulating without having the working experience to know that they do. And that doesn't go for everybody, because there's a lot of recording enthusiasts out there that work in studios part-time and get an opportunity to sit down with some of these hardware EQs and compressors that have legendary status that are now being reproduced in software. So I think it's nice to be able to use the emulations, and I certainly use quite a few of them, and some I use and I have experience with them, and some I use and I don't, and I just know that they're wonderful, or they have a wonderful history. And if I can get something out of them to EQ my guitar track, then I've succeeded. I have spent some time with hardware, lunchbox hardware, which is smaller versions of the EQs and compressors, etc., that have been in studios. So you could take an SSL 4000E EQ and you can buy it in a lunchbox version. And I'm going to show you a picture here of a lunchbox version. And I had a lot of this hardware set up. I had API, SSL, Moog stuff, Shadow, Hills, quite a variety of hardware. And here's what I found. There was some wonderful sounds that you could get from this, and results that you could get using this on tracks. The problem for me was it was extremely slow in the process, because I had spent years with software and then decided I should try some of the hardware to get an idea of what this hardware was that I was buying so many emulations of. And for about 3 years, I used it pretty regularly and used software with it, but mostly the hardware that I purchased. And I had probably about 14 to 16 lunchbox pieces, mostly EQs and compressors. There were some delays and reverbs in there as well. And what I found is for my home studio and project studio, I didn't see enough of a value to slow down my workflow so much. And when I went back and started doing ABs with the software, so if I took the SSL 4000 EQ and then used the software version of it, I probably noticed a little bit of a difference, thinking maybe the hardware responded a little bit differently, and maybe it was a little bit warmer, to use an adjective that can be a little bit difficult to explain in great detail. But I didn't notice enough of a difference to slow down my workflow and to continue with what was a method of recording that was actually impeding my progress and my workflow, the ability to get stuff done in a timely manner. So I eventually sold off almost all of my lunchbox stuff and went back to software. And so I would say, in regards to the emulations, that they're good. I can't tell you that they're exact, but I don't think that's what matters. Now, outside of the emulations, I like it when folks like FabFilter take what they can do with modern software coding and do things that the emulations never did do, and make the software easier and more effective to use, and try and ignore what might be considered the hype of these older and historic or legendary hardware pieces that we're emulating so much. So again, when I look at the software releases during a month, it's incredible, the amount of updates and new products. So what I'd like to do is take a look at maybe starting to review a couple when I talk about industry news. And again, I'll wait for some feedback and see if that's the general consensus. So I guess the good news is for June is there's a tremendous amount of releases. Some of the DAW updates have some great bug fixes. Studio One version 4 is a great new product. Anytime they change from a number, so we've gone from 3 point whatever it was to 4, that's always an interesting thing to look at. You do have to pay for that update typically, but it's worth looking at. And a good selection of new plugins and a good selection of updates and bug fixes. So that's industry news for June. Thanks so much for joining me. If you enjoy the videos, please subscribe. Look for a new video every Friday, and I'll look for you next time on Sam's Music Room. Bye now.